thank you very much, Mark and Julian. It's very good to be with you all this morning, albeit virtually. As Mark said, I want to be spending the next 40 minutes or so talking a little bit, reflections on the data decade, and in particular what the Open Data Institute has been seeking to achieve. Right, so I will now endeavour to share my screen. Hopefully you can now see the screen. And so yes, well, I've called it our data decade in a certain sense to just kind of contextualize this in the context of the Open Data's mission, the Open Data Institute's mission. So let me say a little bit about that, just to for those who aren't aware. The ODI was founded in 2012. It's an international, independent and not-for-profit organization. We're actually set up as a company limited by guarantee in the UK. So it's not for profit. We do operate both nationally and globally. And I'd like to think that we're pretty well recognized for our work in our open data, on our open data agenda. As Mark said, it was set up, the idea was really from Tim Berners-Lee and myself. We had been working with a variety of governments since 2009, in fact, to open up, in particular, UK data from a government, actually both local and national government, to make it more available, more accessible, to promote a whole range of benefits and goods that I'll come on to. And in fact, at that point, over the 2 or 3 years, the UK had established itself, originally under a Labour government, then under the coalition government, and subsequently a Conservative government, as a leader in the publication and utilization of open data that originated in the public sector. And what became very clear to us is that this data asset had huge benefits. We wanted open data to work for everyone. We wanted it to work for both governments and the private sector. We wanted it to work for individuals and collectives. So our vision and mission was all about trying to find the value in open data, a value that is sometimes economic and is sometimes social in nature. And I think one of the really interesting things is to remind ourselves, this is an early slide I would give on arguing the benefit or the case for open data. And this was that actually there isn't one thing that open data achieves. There are at least 6 broad dimensions you can argue for the benefits of open data. Originally, some of the interest around publishing data had to do with political concerns. Way back in the day, there was the expenses, the scandal. MPs were mired with this whole idea about what they were claiming for their expenses. There was a big push around transparency, being much clearer about what government and tax raised money was being used for. So transparency, accountability, widening participation, all were seen as political benefits of publishing data, and not just an appeal to a particular party. Open data works for governments on the left, the center, the right. They all have, certainly in democratic context, interests around maintaining and promoting transparency and accountability, improving participation. We were also seeing and arguing for economic benefits. The economic benefits were to help improve efficiency, promote innovation, enhance growth. Data made available, as we'll see, of various stripes and types can improve the economic bottom line. But it also has a social dimension that very often some of the best examples we could find in the open data use cases were ones where publishing data made inclusion more effective, helped identify poverty pockets, helped promote diversity. Some of the earliest examples had to do with recognizing that when you got the data published on where utilities or where services were being delivered, there was kind of a postcode variation. And we're kind of familiar with that, but our data published around a whole range of government delivered services could make that rather clear. Data published openly also has a research dimension. I mean, crucially, it's used for research. We have seen that absolutely paradigmatically during the recent pandemic, where data on everything from vaccination rates to transmission levels to infections were being published on data.gov.uk, the kind of government open data publication site, and published in a way that both citizens and experts, clinicians and policymakers could use to inform and drive their understanding of how the pandemic could be dealt with and managed. Open data is at the heart of the ability to disseminate scientific knowledge and to reproduce it. I think it's quite an interesting feature of the recent developments last decade in open data to recognize that in some areas, science has a reproducibility challenge. And what is the most effective way to gain confidence around the results of experiments or research projects? Well, it's to have the data that was originally collected, was originally analyzed, available so that subsequent models, subsequent analyses can reproduce the original insights and results, or at least if they don't reproduce them, then get into the issue of why, what was different. The media has always had a particular affinity for open data. Data stories, in fact, an entire practice of so-called data-driven journalism. Many of the sources that the media depends on are data that we can think of as open data. And again, increasingly, as we've seen through the pandemic, key data published by, for example, the Office for National Statistics were helping drive that sense of insight. And we've seen also an explosion of interest around the data reported in our media. People became armchair experts in everything from epidemiology to vaccine efficiency. That actually did promote a form of data literacy. Publishing data, giving accounts of how to interpret it, is a powerful way of increasing everybody's data skills. And the data itself benefits from being published openly. It benefits in terms of both its acquisition and its quality improvements. It benefits in terms of the fact that more people are able to engage with that data and improve and enrich it going forward. So back to the beginning. Well, there's the original homebrew logo for the Open Data Institute. Knowledge for everyone was a phrase we used. And our original business plan was to create within the Open Data Institute a world-leading center that would be able to innovate and research the opportunities for the UK created by the government's open data policy. It was originally funding from UK Treasury, so we had to attend to UK national priorities, but we always recognized and understood that our lessons and insights could extend more widely, could extend to the international scene. And where we started literally was in actually quite challenging circumstances to acquire and find premises in what at the time in 2012 was the kind of hot technology area of London. It was Shoreditch. It was Shoreditch in the time of the Olympics. That was a challenging rental location opportunity for us. We had to find a place, fit it out, and come in on budget. But we did that and we opened our doors. And by December 2010, our first Chief Executive Officer, Gavin Starks, was talking at TechCrunch and trying to explain the opportunity of open data. And that there was so much more to exploit and derive from the open data opportunity. And the ODI was seen as enabling organizations and individuals to find and exploit whole new markets, whole new business opportunities to understand not just the economic, but the social and cultural trends that data could reveal. And also experiment with ways of explaining this emerging ecosystem. We often talk about the open data or the data ecosystem, the components, the environment, the context, the health of that ecosystem, the rewards and incentives that are present in that ecosystem. And explaining how that was emerging was one of the core original requirements and objectives for the Institute. And in fact, one of our early slides that became very widely used and adopted in business, in politics, was our so-called data spectrum. Here we tried to express just how rich and varied the data space was. The data spectrum, we were kind of appealing to this idea almost of the electromagnetic spectrum. As you move from one side to the next, the character and nature of data would change. So on the bottom, we could start with what we thought of as closed data that for various reasons was held close to organizations or individuals, internal access, possibly sensitive data such as employment contracts and policies or sales reports or one's own particular key data about oneself that you wanted to kind of secure. And as you moved across the spectrum, you moved into shared data, data that was given various permission-based access to individuals and other groups and collectives via authorization, named access, group-based access. And as you moved increasingly to the right, you began to encounter what we understood as fully open data, data that was available to anyone with an open license. And we were already beginning to see the flourishing of those data sets, everything from travel timetables to the weather. Those data sets can be very large, so-called big data, or quite small. Data that's valuable doesn't have to be characterized by being gigabytes in scale. Often it's an enumeration, relatively compact. For example, the company's house data, which lists all of the legally constituted companies in the UK. That data is not vast, but it's important. It's essential. It tells us something about the environment and society we live and work in. So these kinds of ideas, the data spectrum, for example, allowed us to explain that there was no single policy that fitted every strain or variety or species of data, that you would need to adapt and accommodate, that you need to understand how licenses varied. You need to understand how incentives to use that data might vary. You need to understand its origins. You'd need to understand the scope for disseminating it widely or not, depending on the type of data it was. And I think one of the things we established early on was that we were not advocating that all data should be made open. In a sense, a completely unsustainable view of the world. But what we were arguing for, to take another imagination of the data ecosystem, rather than thinking of data as a spectrum, thinking of it as a pyramid, where the bottom foundation layer of your data is as broad as it can be to establish firm foundations for other types of data, and that data would be thought of as open data. So we would advocate for as much data as feasible to be made open, but recognizing that there were always other types of data that would need to be more cautiously shared or kept in relatively tight control. Other concepts that we've been promoting in our last decade, a key concept for us, one that we now see talked about routinely, was data as infrastructure. Now, we understand infrastructure, physical infrastructure, the roads and rail system when it's working, the roads and rail system, the power grids that drive our electricity networks, the utility grids, those sorts of infrastructures, physical infrastructures, they're tangible. They have locations, they have particular purposes, and they have a whole set of support to allow the particular infrastructure service to be supported. Data, we argued, is exactly like this. Although it's immaterial, can be thought of as intangible, is in the ether, literally. It's no less structurally important, vital, and essential. And the characteristics we think of any physical infrastructure apply, many of them apply directly into a data infrastructure. Now, examples of this, some of the early successes we had in opening up data in the UK was to open up large amounts of ordnance surveys, geospatial data. And here on this slide, we're seeing a little bit of the administrative data that relates to various parts of the geography of the United Kingdom. Now, clearly, that data as infrastructure needs to have particular attributes, needs to be reliable, needs to be durable, efficient, scalable. It needs to be transparent. You've got to be able to reuse it in different contexts. You see those characteristics on the left. You've got to be able to revise it easily and straightforwardly. There needs to be a lot of metadata describing the data itself. And appropriately for the digital data we're talking about here, we need to think about how to organize it, to abstract it, to wrap it up, to parcel it, to deliver it out. So on this slide, we're seeing three examples that I think illustrate this well. The first is the administrative geospatial data. Underneath there is another way of delivering data as infrastructure, and this is the Transport for London's Unified Application Programming Interface, or API, which is delivering real-time transport data, which many other apps are able to use, and I'll reference back to that later. On the right, we see the drug ontology, or the specification of how drugs are described using various standard medical terminology, which again constitutes part of our data infrastructure. As you go from sector to sector, you will find in our digitally driven age a need for schemas, for formats, for standards, and the population of those assets to a stable, high degree. And that is what we mean by data as infrastructure. And if you take that view seriously, then a lot of things flow. You have to, for example, worry about maintaining it, investing in it. You have to be concerned about how you keep it secure, in the sense that, yes, it's an open product, but you need to be able to ensure that people can find it, can be confident that what they're seeing is what it claims to be, and that it isn't able to be subverted or distorted or variously attacked. Like any infrastructure, a data infrastructure comes with certain security requirements. So what is the impact of this opening up of data? And I wanted to give three examples here, all of which the ODI has been involved with. The first one is our Transport for London data sets, where working with the organization, working with TfL and others, the whole opening up of their data in real time has allowed a huge amount of innovation. Everybody from Waze to Twitter to Google to Apple, Citymapper, Bus Checker, Bus Times, as well as academics and non-commercial customer-facing organizations are using this data. And it's allowed passengers and other road users to have new services that help them travel much more easily across London. Insights like this can also help TfL provide better services and feed into more accurate planning for increasing capacity. So you get this virtuous cycle of innovation around the open data that's made available. This was a change, a significant change for TfL when it moved to making this data openly available. It changed the economics of their entire operation. They were no longer charging for access. They were able to reap the benefits of wide-scale innovation around their data. Open banking. We have actually on our open banking, on the open banking website. This was an initiative started in the UK and now is adopted across Europe and in many countries. And here, open refers to the standards that are used to describe accounts, bank accounts, and the various other financial objects of interest in such a way that a whole range of third-party services are now available that allow you to move banks, to compare and exchange services between banks. Or open corporates, which is our one of our, I think, the poster children in the UK for open data that's innovated out of an early resident in the Open Data Institute, Chris Taggart's, who founded the company. It now catalogs 192 million companies in 140 jurisdictions. It identifies 247 million officers of those companies. It essentially gives you a directory of constituted companies around the world. And in some jurisdictions, those are exhaustive enumerations. Why do we want to know about corporate structure? Things like beneficial ownership, who's actually got share stakes in various of these companies. Well, for all sorts of reasons that range from transparency through to being able to research and understand the health and vitality of companies in various states. Throughout, the Open Data Institute has had a view of itself which attempts to embody expertise, to be enabling of others' opportunities and ambitions, and to be fearless, to try and go out there and make difficult things happen. We've always had fantastic staff, and we've organized ourselves into programs of work. Most recently, and I'll talk about some of these programs of work in more detail now, around major verticals. I should just say that the ODI now has a headcount of around 65 full-time employees based in the King's Cross in the Knowledge Quarter, and moving about just before the pandemic, in fact, moving from its Shoreditch original base to King's Cross. And that puts us really at the heart, the physical heart of a growing range of data-driven and indeed AI-driven companies. The programs of work, well, you can see their data literacy, data assurance, data institutions, the data ecosystem and innovations are therein, and an evidence and foresight program with associated disciplines such as policy and research. I will say something now about those programs. Let me talk first of all about the data literacy. It's quite clear, and I'm sure it's very clear to you as members of DAMA in what you do, that there's still an extraordinary need for improving and extending the data skills across and within organizations. Again, if I look back on our experience in the pandemic, one of the very early examples around the importance of that was actually, I remember the original models that were coming out of the work of Ferguson and his group at Imperial on modeling the pandemic. There was a lot of concern at the time that were these models and the data they were based on, were they authentic? Were they reliable? Were they of high quality? And there was a lot of concern that maybe the code need to be looked at and really understood transparently for what it was. Actually, code as data is a very interesting concept here. At the time, I wrote an op-ed, a number of people were saying it is really important to have confidence, and to have confidence, you should make those products open. And indeed, that model was actually carefully re-engineered and then republished, and people could look in minute detail at every line to give themselves confidence that the predictions and assumptions that were made in the model that were appearing in the papers and driving the policy were in fact valid, robust, and secure. That was an interesting example where domain experts themselves had a real sense of wanting to be confident in their understanding, in their data skills, in their data insights. But from there on in, we've seen example after example where data, when published, has been put into a context where its understanding, its appreciation is crucial. And if we look at, for example, from everything from mortality rates in different countries to vaccine uptake in different regions, to the effects of lockdowns in various parts, mobilities in various cities, all of those aspects of managing a global pandemic have received scrutiny, not just from the original epidemiologists, but from a whole range of data roles, new roles, people who manage the data at scale, people who broker it, trying to arrange for access to it, the people who really understand the minute details of the data asset itself, to the analysts who will be applying statistical methods to understand the patterns that are inherent in the data, to the curators, to journalists who are writing about it, to the interested citizen data scientist, or in simple terms, the consumer or citizen who's being affected by this. That appetite, that hunger for understanding how to interpret data, how to publish it in the first place, how to make sense of it, and the models into which it's put, we've really seen that come to the fore. And I think it makes the need for our data literacy programs. And in the ODI, we train everyone from policymakers through to the people doing the data curation on the ground, through to people who are trying to think about educational curricula that can build these sensibilities into our school systems and our various accreditation systems. Data literacy has been, will be, and certainly is set to be one of the critical challenges going forward, and it constitutes one of our major programs of work. I'm going to talk about some more impact here from the ODI's work, just to give a flavor of the work we do. So here is work that we're literally undertaking right now with the Met Police, and this is around helping them understand how they can publish information more effectively around their services and what they do, not least to help build public confidence. You may remember that one of the much vaunted and early data sets that government produced, and I remember working very closely with the Home Office on this, was the reported crime data, which you can still find published routinely. And this gives you a sense of what types of crime are occurring in what particular areas of the country. This was such a popular data set when it was released that the IT provision that the government had set up melted in the morning it was released. They had to keep on increasing the provision of compute and cloud power to deliver this, the amount of interest that was coming inbound to look at these visualizations of what crimes were occurring where. And of course, at the time, again, there was a lot of concern around if this data was published, would there be these unintended consequences? Would that be the end of how particular house prices in an area if there was seen to be high levels of endemic crime? All of this turned out to be not at all the problem compared to the confidence that people had in being able to see for the first time what was happening where, to have conversations with their local police forces around whether or not policing levels were appropriate, where there needed to be attention to what seemed to be increasing patterns of a particular type of crime in a particular area. Very rich conversations between citizens and the police forces themselves, between citizens and the politicians who were making decisions about what resources should go into policing. And we see this kind of work with police forces and a whole range of other public sector levers as ongoing key work that the ODI undertakes. Work that now looks very prescient in the context of the terrible events in Ukraine at the moment was work that we did in 2019 with the government of Ukraine to help them build and maintain their own sustainable open data program. So here we were trying to take lessons learned from the UK's experience of publishing open data and produce a model which was essentially open by default. And again, this was partly to counter concerns within the Ukraine that there were issues around corruption, around issues about understanding how to stimulate economic value from the activity that was being promoted to build confidence in an emerging democratic system. And that consolidation is work that we're very proud to have been associated with. Interestingly, in 2021, our work with UK power networks really was work on a piece of our national infrastructure, but trying to harness, in a sense, the data infrastructure to go alongside that physical infrastructure. So UK Power Networks Open Data Portal has got one of the biggest sets of information about the electricity network, and that portal brings together many thousands of data sets from a very wide range of resources to give ourselves visibility of network assets, where they are, what capacity they have, and how they're being used. And this is exactly the sort of, we often refer to this as trying to build a twin almost of, digital twin of part of our physical infrastructure. Publishing that data, having a portal, having access to it helps everyone from local authorities who are thinking about where their services are running well and effectively, to people who are installing electric vehicle charge points, to renewable energy generators. Anyone with an interest in low carbon technology is also going to want to pick up on this data to understand what the characteristics of our current power network infrastructure is. And finally, another example I thought I'd bring to attention is our work back in 2015. We worked extensively with the department, with DEFRA, our Environmental and Rural Affairs Department, to release their data at scale. In fact, over 10,000 data sets were released. The Secretary of State then was Liz Truss. In fact, she was pushing very hard for this environmental data release. And just one example, the LiDAR data that was released about across the country, extremely valuable. That data is now used, the DEFRA data sets, to power everything from river levels, the risk of flood, water quality, always in, and seems to be currently in the news. It's been used in Minecraft even to discover 17 kilometers, I believe, of Roman roads, which were not mapped or catalogued or understood at the time. I think all of the work that the ODI has been doing is also framed in the context of broader commitments that we also try and support and sustain. And in particular, the goals for sustainable development include these 17 key areas: to eliminate poverty, hunger, promote good health, maintain quality education, support gender equality, provide clean water and sanitation. As you go across all of these sustainability goals, you can find a critical role for open data in each and every one of them. And we find that the partitioning of these goals help us think sectorally about the work we want to do and how we want to work with both private and public organizations, states around the world, to promote the benefits of data to improve life. Now, you can always imagine when you start a journey the 10 years or so that the ODI has been in existence, what seemed very challenging at the outset turns out, as you build experience, as you build your own capacity, to become possible. I should say one of the significant challenges for the ODI at the outset was that we were initially given a 5-year grant from government to get started. And over that time, we've received generous amounts of funding from government, but we've also been the beneficiaries of funding from philanthropic organizations who have been very major supporters of ours, but also from the wider public sector and also, crucially, the private sector. Increasingly, companies who are coming to us to understand how not just governmental data, but their own data might be used to improve their own performance or the performance of suppliers in their supply chain or the experience of their customers. So open data made available across the broadest spectrum of activity, from economic to social benefits and ends. So let me now just conclude with a reflection about the next 10 years. What's likely to happen? Well, I'll bring you back to those pillars of activity, because I talked about data literacy, but there are a number of others that are ongoing and that I think will feature even larger as we move forward. We're going to see undoubtedly huge amounts of additional deployment of AI, from automated to semi-automated decision-making in every kind of sector. We're going to see more data roles. I talked about some of them on the slide relating to data literacy, whole new classes of activity of people who have to maintain data, curate it, arbitrate its use from one context to another, deliver training associated with it. We'll see a continued interest around personal data, how the data that I generate on a daily basis and through my life, how that relates to me in terms of potential ownership rights, privacy, and its ultimate exploitation. A lot of work going on here to think about how we can get a better balance between the exploitation of my data, not just for other people's benefit, but for my benefit directly. There will be undoubtedly continued interest around data value distribution. So who is going to get the benefits from the data that is created? And everything from data justice to digital twins. So actually, are there questions inherent in the data we use about whether it is fairly and equitably used, to integrated smart cities, to foundation models? And on that note, let me just move to a few specific areas that I see coming to the fore. One of these is data ethics. We already talk extensively about the duties and obligations that fall on us as generators and owners of data. We have to ensure that it's in some sense fair or representative, that it doesn't have inherent bias that leads to miscarriages of decision-making, that it's safe and sustainable. Data ethics, I think, will only increase in importance and relevance. There's going to be a very significant challenge around what we call data assurance. And in the ODI, data assurance ranges from everything from trying to assure that a data set itself has the characteristics you want from it, to its use in a particular context being safe and secure. So it kind of relates quite closely to some of those ethical questions, but this is technical methods and process methods to ensure that you are confident about the product being used and the output of the data being used in decision making. Now here, the emergence of modern AI with these very large machine learning models presents a particular problem because they're quite hard to interpret and understand. They're often referred to as black boxes, but we are going to have to get inside those black boxes to assure them, to credit them, to actually warrant that they are behaving in ways that are fair and safe and reasonable. And the most recent manifestation of that is the emergence of so-called foundation models, where a number of companies are able to train extraordinarily large models that are now used to, for example, generate text, translate text, map text to images. And the ability to build those models is actually held by a relatively few companies at this point. So there's a natural question around monopolies, around platform power, but there's also a legitimate question around what are the inherent features of these models driven by huge amounts of data that are ingested off the web. Do we know how fair, how they work in edge conditions, how brittle or otherwise these approaches to decision making are? And I'll leave you with a final area that I think is going to become extremely important. This is the notion of data institutions. We've seen this begin to figure. And again, if I think of one thing that the ODI has done over the last 10 years that's been consequential, it's been this introduction, I said from the outset, of new terms, of new concepts. We talked about the data spectrum at the outset, but now we talk about data institutions. New forms. So the insight here is that it isn't, in a data-driven world, just about the technology and the software engineering and the open standards, the publication methods. It's not about innovations in those architectures and those processes that we just need to sit. It's a form of organizational innovation, organizational architectures that we may need to invent, create, institute, that allow us to manage and create the new widespread data assets that are coming into being. So when we talk about data institutions, we think of everything from what we think of as data mutuals or cooperatives, where groups of individuals get together with an agreement to find common purpose in using a data asset. And this might extend to setting up what we refer to as data trusts, where there's a clear notion of stewardship, of trustees, of a constitution about how a data asset should be used. So we see a space of innovation happening around the institutions, around the frameworks, the regulatory structures that allow data to be used. And this may apply particularly across those data assets that aren't necessarily going to be completely openly available, but may be shared in more task-specific ways. The Open Data Institute has always stood to find the maximal value in open data as an asset, but it also, going forward, needs to understand how all varieties and types of data can live together, can flourish in a future which will only be more data intensive than we can imagine even now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nigel. That's very interesting. We've had a number of questions have come in the meantime while you've been talking. So I'm going to start off with a question from Emmanuel Ude, who asks, I'm curious what has been the biggest challenge faced on this journey of driving openness of data, and which industry or industries have you seen the biggest pushback from in making data more open and freely available for collaboration?
Well, I think the second part of the question kind of implies an answer to the first, which is undoubtedly there is still a sense in many quarters that making data available is in some sense giving an asset away that could be of value to you or your organization more than a wider group. It's the notion that, what are you trying to maximize? And I think what we have often found in areas where we've said this data actually would serve a wider set of benefits, not just to you as an organization, but more broadly, make it open, and you will allow value to be created across a much broader scheme. And an early example of this was work we did with Thomson Reuters around their business identifiers for a whole range of products and services in the financial and information space. Prior to our work with them, they had made their catalog essentially a charge for resource. Once they made that available, they realized that a huge amount of additional business and interest was driven to them because they were the preferred site of understanding. They were the authority, the data authority for this particular aspect of the data infrastructure. So those are the kind of conversations that you can have with organizations that make them realize, okay, yeah, this is something that we've got an asset here, which is an asset to us, but actually has value much wider than sweating a local rent for it, for example. Now, I think the challenge on the other side is that sometimes people, they have lots of reasons why they are less than willing perhaps to give their data out there. And I remember when we did the early work, we'd often collect all these various reasons that we had for what we call data hugging. And it included the fear of giving away unintended value to someone else that you haven't quite worked out how to realize yourself, but it might be there, so better not. Or the data perhaps isn't as good as it possibly could be, so we better hang on till we make it better, which never quite gets there, So there are many reasons, or, being performance managed around that data. Does it mean that we'll just get more criticism for whatever that data is relating to if it relates to a service? And I think that sometimes, I think we're taking when we work with companies, we take them on that journey. But I think people who sit on that public service delivery can be very nervous initially. But it's been interesting to see, as we've talked to utilities, for example, they've become more engaged. As we've talked to organizations that initially would have a view that their data was best understood, distributed by them, they've realized the benefits they get from being part of a wider ecosystem. So I wouldn't call out one particular sector as being more or less kind of recalcitrant at all. I think that we've seen examples from a whole range of sectors that you might have thought would have been quite diffident about stepping forward, making that leap and really benefiting from it. And I've given you some of the examples here today.
Thank you, Sir Nigel. A couple of questions come through, sort of a hybrid one from Tim, who I know is, like me, has got a lot of interest in data quality. So he's really interested in the fact, pleased that you've not used the phrase data quality, which hides a lot of complexity and challenge. How has the ODI determined the range and priority of data requirements that apply to open data? And also Glenn, who's also a panelist with me, is also curious about whether the ODI might have a role in policing data quality or
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important point, right? So we know that it's super important that we know certain characteristics of our data. And again, it will depend on what the data is, what it relates to, as to what the latency is. Does it need to be, what does real-time data mean in this context? And how useful is it if it's somewhat historic? Is it still useful? Or what do we need to know about the conditions under which it was collected? Or what do we need to know about the range of data that was collected? And you go on and on and on. And I think one of the interesting things about when you're doing data engineering in these spaces is to understand how you describe that set of characteristics that are valuable. And in doing that, annotating your data sets in that way is a really, really important additional value to everyone. It still amazes me how sparse some data models are effectively for particular data assets. It's not enough to know that a particular attribute is collected. You want to know much more about the context of collection. And then the question is, as you move from domain to domain, just how critical does that become? So you can think, of course, that real-time travel data has got some fairly clearly testable parameters about what it is to be of use, what it is to be reasonably collected, etc. And the question then about how you warrant it going forward, what are the questions around its accreditation, data sets accreditation? I am sure, by the way, that this will become a very significant profession of the 21st century, a new class of insurance products, essentially, that says something about what the quality is that is required to deliver a particular kind of service and how far or not a particular data asset is meeting that requirement. And to credit or assure data in that way is certainly, I think, that organizations like the ODI are looking at very seriously with others to work out what might be helpful, what is in the service of making a more trusted and effective data ecosystem going forward. And this is what has happened in the past when engineered infrastructures became critical to running services. And whether that was power or originally steam, some of our earliest standards organizations were built around just those assurances, those design assurances.
That's great, thank you. I think Mark's struggling to see all the questions, so I'll lead on from here. But there's a really interesting question here come through from Chris, and I think it's actually also a lead into later in the week when we've got Alex Luck talking about security. So Chris's question is, he works for a power company in Norway, and they have to be very secretive about the electrical grid, as quite clearly as a sensitive asset from war and terror attacks. Did you have any similar obstacles working with the UK national grid?
You know, again, there's always this balance, because people can take data, published data, and say, isn't this a matter of national security? And I remember actually in the US there's a whole furore around them publishing the geolocation of cell phone towers. Okay, and this was thought, well, this is just a target list. Or similarly for some of the data that was published in our NAPTAN, in our National Transportation Access Points, you know. And you cannot say that if you there isn't a security dimension to any data that's published. What you have to say is, how do you trade off the availability of that as against the potential threat? In an era of high resolution satellite service provision, it's hard to imagine that fixed physical infrastructure is a thing that you literally can't see. Now, of course, other sorts of infrastructure aren't necessarily above surface, they're not visible. And then the question is, well, do we want to publish the positions of all of the switch boxes of our internet system in the UK? And these are used as real examples. So then the question is, where is the value in the open data that's being published? Is it actually its physical location, or its functional existence within a topology, within a network? And so again, what you decide to publish and how you decide to publish can make a difference as to whether you think you've presented yourself with something of a security risk. But our view is that very often the utility you derive from many of your assets being in a public format that is publicly accessible gets you broader benefits. Of course, one can always revert back to, and perhaps to kind of security threats, but that applies from everything from knowing where the switching points on your railway system are. Is that something that publishing data on it makes you less secure than people will be able to inspect this by inspection, see what's outside of their own backroom window? So it does seem to me that we can sometimes get too sensitive to these issues. And sometimes there are ways of representing the information in a way which derives a lot of its benefit without giving the perhaps sensitive characteristics that people might worry about an open publication.
Yeah, thank you, Nigel. So like I say, I think the session later this week from Alex Luck will also explore that a bit more in detail. Also, Deb Yates, who works for the ODI, has actually put a very useful link in the chat for those who might be interested. We're sort of running out of time, but I think probably a last one, which might be a value really, is a question from Matthew, who was commenting about last week the UK government published the Transforming for a Digital Future 2022 to 2025 roadmap for digital and data, and just wondered if you had any thoughts, or ODI had any thoughts about that roadmap.
Well, I think the roadmap, I mean, we have been talking with government, DCMS and others who have, BEIS and others who have been thinking about these issues. We think a roadmap's super important. We think the ambition about how to use data assets, how to use the public and private data assets we have available is crucially important. We think issues around, there are also ongoing issues around how that relates to personal data, the issue around GDPR. There are issues that concerns that maybe some aspects of that are overly cumbersome on the one hand, but on the other hand, we recognize that people are increasingly interested in their personal data, so-called smart data that they generate, being used constructively and in ways that empowers them and isn't used to kind of manage them or track them or survey them. And I think that is an area where the ODI has worked and is going to be working increasingly with government to find that balance point. So the ambition should still be, I think, one that we aspire to. I think it's important that all governments recognize that the progress made is not inevitably secured unless investments are made to keep on publishing, to keep on generating, and to identify areas where new data will be required to address the challenges of the 21st century. One slight nervousness I have is often people think that data infrastructures are kind of stuff you build off the exhaust data that's generated by other people. Sometimes you have to take a decision that an important class of data has to be collected, as it was in the pandemic, has to be collected and has to be made available openly to high quality. And those are the questions that investment in new data assets is one that I'm keen that we continue to talk with government and we map into their roadmap going forward.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Sir Nigel. That's been a fascinating talk and a great way to kick off this virtual event. Just want to remind everyone who's listening that all our webinars this week will be recorded and will be available through the BCS and DAMA websites. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.